Welcome to the third episode of some of my thoughts on the letter of James in the New Testament and how it relates to some of our nation's most pressing issues these days. Um, and you can find the first two on my Facebook page or on YouTube under Barney Wiggett. But I believe that the main theme of James' letter is the clash between Christianity and classism. It wasn't just the disparity between the rich and the poor, but the despair that it brings the poor and the injustice imposed on them by the rich that really bothered James and bothers God and should bother us. You know, I experienced that disparity in San Francisco for nearly 10 years living there. That city has the greatest disparity between rich and poor in the whole country. And the despair of the poor is palpable there. It really is. There's people living in $25 million mansions, pulling down half of that every year in salary, with other divine image bearers living on the street in tents. There's just something wrong with that picture. Well, James chapter 1, verses 9 to 11 kind of addresses some of that. He says, believers in humble circumstances ought to take pride in their high position. That's a bizarre statement. Ought to take pride in their high position, though they have humble circumstances. But he says, but the rich should take pride in their humiliation, since they will pass away like a wild flower. For the sun rises with scorching heat and withers the plant. Its blossom fails and its beauty is destroyed. In the same way, the rich will fade away even while they go about their business. Another version says, any of God's people who are poor should be glad that he thinks so highly of them. But any of the rich should be glad when he makes them humble. Like the Old Testament prophets, James, he speaks of God's preferential treatment of the poor and the vulnerable. And when I say God is partial to the poor, I don't mean that he's biased. There's a difference. He's partial to the poor in the same way that firefighters are partial to houses that are on fire over the ones that are not on fire. You know, when people say about Black Lives Matter, they say all lives matter. Well, when you call 911 and tell them, come quickly, my house is on fire, you don't want to hear, ma'am, all houses matter. You know, when your house is on fire, like the houses of the black communities, and the fire engine just keeps passing you by as though you don't matter, you too might call out, my house matters. You know, a good dad will protect his weakest son from being beaten by his strongest son, but in that regard, he shows the weak son, you could call it preferential treatment. So as a matter of justice, God particularly prefers, protects, and identifies with the weakest members of the community. I mean, you see that in the crowd that Jesus hung around with, right? They called him James, James the Just, because he railed against the injustice as the apostle of the church in Jerusalem. And systemic justice was at the top of his hit list. And he was kind of a hit man kind of apostle if you read his letter. And it wasn't just that he cared about the poor, but he cared about the systemic mistreatment of them. He rebuked those who created the system set up to benefit the upper class at the expense of the underclass. Whether we're talking about, you know, ethnic or gender or socioeconomic distinctions, the majority culture has no right before God to a sense of superiority over the minority. So God, he doesn't object to socioeconomic groups themselves. He objects to the social realities attached to them. So it's not a matter of the poor guy is good and the rich guy is bad, but it's the realities of the poor, of the power of the rich, I should say, over the powerlessness of the poor. That's what God objects to. He's not so. It's not that he's so concerned about personal wealth as the systemic abuse of it. In a system that favors the wealthy and the powerful, that's a problem to God. Craig Greenfield said that though Jesus never rails against those with six-figure incomes, it seems pretty obvious that he would be resolutely against a six-figure lifestyle in a world where children are starving. You know, even if we didn't maybe have hundreds of biblical passages proving God's partiality for the poor and the vulnerable, we'd know it by the way that Jesus was born in a barn, lived as a homeless itinerant preacher, and washed the feet of his followers. I mean, he showed it to us in living color, the priorities of God and the preferential treatment of the poor by God. You know, in the world, the poor are disdained and the rich are acclaimed. But for God and for us, those distinctions, they should mean absolutely nothing. Possessions, or the lack thereof, they don't assign relative value to anybody. As a human, you get your value from something much more substantial than that. So it's not net worth, it's eternal worth. James is saying in this passage that those with less never have to feel like they are less, and those with more should never feel like they are more. You know, the Bible indicates that riches are flattering and they're fleeting. They come and go, and they give a false impression about your real self. They say you're important if you're rich and powerful, and you're pathetic if you're poor. The kingdom changes all of that. And Christianity and classism, they just don't get along at all. Tim Keller said, in the church, the social distinctions of the world are obliterated, and no one matters more than any other. So since the least, the last, and the lost, they matter so much in God's eyes, we have to train our eyes to look through God's eyes. So I'm going to stop there. I'm trying to keep these talks short, just to whet your appetite for more study on your own, and to check out maybe the podcast where I unpack this passage in greater detail at soundcloud.com, Musing the Mysteries. Thanks for watching.